If you saw my Tableau 2020.1 review, you heard the promise. If you didn't see the review, I'll put a link up here and you can take a watch and you will see the promise to get your hands on with Tableau. Today's the day, so Tableau 2020.1 hands-on is coming up. Hi, it's George with Ablaze. This is the first, but not the last, chance for you to get your hands on with Tableau here on our Ablaze Group channel. This is going to be probably 45 minutes to an hour of your time, depending on how much time you take for the exercises. Here's the way this is going to work. I'm going to demo some concepts you can watch, and then I'm going to have you go through hands-on exercises on your own to reinforce the concepts. Two things that we need to do before we get started. First of all, make sure you have Tableau 2020.1 or later installed on your computer, and here's how to find out. Start Tableau, pull down the Help menu, and choose About Tableau. Look at the top for a version number. 2020.1 or later is required. If you have a 2019 version or earlier, that's not going to work. New features we're covering today require 2020.1 or later. Now, if you have a copy of Tableau 2020.1 already and you're fully licensed, you're good to go. If you want to learn Tableau and you haven't purchased it yet, you can go to the Tableau website, linked down below, and download a 14-day trial copy. Make sure you don't activate it too soon so that you run out of time before you finish watching the video, but you can use Tableau free 14-day trial. Get it down below. What I want you to do now is make sure you have Tableau 2020.1 or later installed, and also go to our website, the link below and the link above, to download the exercise workbook and some sample data sources. You got to do that before we get started. Yes, I'm going to ask you for your email address. No, we won't share it. We will send you occasional emails about consulting or training or user group information. You can opt out anytime. Go ahead, make sure you have Tableau 2020.1 or later installed. Go download and unzip the sample files. Pause the video while you do that, and then come on back and we'll get started. All right, welcome back. Here's the way we're going to work this today. We're going to show you concepts on the screen and then let you do them on your own from the exercise workbook. The assumption is you already have some working experience with Tableau, experience connecting to data, using the rows and column shelves, using the marks card, using filters, maybe some parameter experience, and a little bit of experience with calculated fields. But here's the deal. If you have not used Tableau before, you can go step by step with me through each of the exercises, and I'll cover all the bases so you can learn Tableau from the ground up today. It's a great opportunity if you haven't used the tool before for 3 hours. If you've used it for 3 years, I guarantee you're going to learn something new today. It's going to be great. So here's what we're going to learn today. Some core new concepts of Tableau 2020.1, starting with some new features with explain data. Next, dynamic parameters, waiting for that for a long time. Then we're going to discuss the buffer function, a new calculated field function that's helpful for mapping. Animation lets your charts come to life with movement. We'll cover that. And we wrap up with the dashboard export button. Nice new feature. So here we go. Number 1, explain data enhancements. On any chart, you can click a mark being a bar or a pie or a line segment. In this case, I have a stacked bar chart, so a mark is one of the bars or one of the bar stacks. So if you click a mark, you get a tooltip, and one of the things that you might not have noticed before is the small little light bulb icon, and if you click it, you display an Explain Data dialog box. Explain Data goes behind the scenes and takes the data that makes that particular mark up and does a sub-analysis on it. In some case, you may actually get one or more sub-analyses down here. In some cases, you just may get a message that everything is expected and there's not really a lot to explain. The option that's new in 2020.1 is moderately important, and that is the ability to resize the Explain Data dialog box. That didn't exist before, and if you've got a larger screen resolution, you may actually benefit from that because now you can see more of the Explain Data information here in the resize dialog box. The other feature is a very small little eye icon in the lower right. And if you click that, you're going to get even more detailed information about what Tableau did to come to its sub-analysis. So again, the two new features in 2020, resizable dialog box, the information icon in the status bar, those are the new features as part of overall Explain Data capability. All right, so there's a look at Explain Data. Now, once you complete the hands-on exercise, you can either come back and I'll go through it with you, or you can simply skip to the next part. You'll have an option. Look down below for both links. The links are also in the PDF file. Pause the video, go through the hands-on exercise, and then I'll see you back here. Go through Exercise 1, Explain Data. And for those of you who are familiar with Tableau, forgive some of the fundamental techniques here. I want to make sure we cover all the bases, and if you are new to Tableau, I want to take you through it step by step. When you first start Tableau and have the Start screen, the first thing you do if you're going to work with a new workbook or a new set of visualizations is connect to data. In this case, we have a Retail Sales XLSX Excel file. You can use that as a data source for Tableau. So I'm going to connect in the home screen to Microsoft Excel and navigate to my desktop. I've got a folder that I unzipped there called Tableau 2021 Hands-On, and in there is the Retail Sales XLSX data file. I'm going to open that. Now that displays a Data Source tab, and over in the left shows me the sheets within that Excel workbook that are available to me to analyze. And I want to use 3 of these sheets for my analysis, and I'm just going to drag the sheets I want over to the Drag Sheets Here side. I could also double-click them. And the 3 sheets I want to use are Orders that I'll drag first, Customer that I want to drag second, and Employee that I want to drag third. And when I drag these, Tableau will automatically join them together. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. In this case, it's all right. So once I've dragged those 3 sheets, I am ready to now go to my Worksheet 1, which is the tab down here at the bottom, and now I am ready to begin analyzing data. Real quickly, for those who are new with the tool set, the data has been broken down into what are referred to as dimensions and measures. Dimensions are qualitative fields. I will get 1 bar per each company or 1 bar per position. So these are used for breaking data into chunks, bars, and circles. Measures at the bottom are numeric values like order amount or salary, and these are used to quantify. They determine the size of the bars, the size of the circles. Measures numeric, dimensions non-numeric, measures quantitative, and dimensions, I might say, qualitative. Now, before I actually begin doing any visual analysis, the request is to create a calculated field named Sales Rep. And I want to take a subset of my employee table, the subset being only employees who have a position of sales representative. And if the position is sales representative, I want to take the employee first name and last name fields and tack them together with a space in between. We create calculated fields in Tableau by going to the top of our data pane and clicking the little tiny drop-down arrow to the right of the Dimensions heading. We get a context menu, and the option to create calculated field is what I'm going to choose. Now I have a calculated field dialog box, and I first want to give my calculated field a meaningful name. Calculation 1 doesn't mean anything. So I'm going to call this calculated field Sales Rep. I'm going to click down now inside the text box of my calculated field. There's a little gray arrow over here, and if I click it, it expands my calculated field dialog box to include a list of what are called functions. If I look in my calculated field area, I have a logical sub category of functions. And if I choose that, hey, look, here is if and else. I'm going to use some of those. So what I want to begin with is testing the position to see if it equals the combination of words sales representative. So I'm going to use the word if. I'm just going to double click it. The word if gets put in my calculated field. I could have typed if I want. Now I'm going to start typing, and I want to test the position field, so I'll start typing a P. And as I type P's, I get what's called an autocomplete option, and I can see functions like power, or functions like make point, or fields like ponum, or fields like position, which I'm going to choose. If position equals sign, and I want to compare the position to what I call a fixed or literal string, which I surround with quotation marks. If position equals sales representative, and misspelling inside quotes is the reason about half of the Tableau calculated fields don't work. Make sure you spell properly. Now I'm going to follow with the word then, and if I want to find it over here, there it is. I can double click it, or I can just type TH, and it begins to auto-complete with everything with a TH in it, and when I find then, I'm just going to press Tab. Now, I don't have to, but to make this calculated field easier to read, I'm going to press Enter and Tab over. And if that is the case, then I want this calculated field to concatenate or tack together two fields. The employee first name field, and I start typing EMP, and it autofills. Concatenation is done in calculated fields in Tableau with a plus. And I want to concatenate a space, a literal string, kind of like the sales representative up there, so I surround it with quotation marks. Another concatenation with a plus, and I want to concatenate last name. Well, I could also just come over here to my data pane and find my employee last name field and drag and drop it in my calculated field. So several ways of getting fields in here. Now, I don't have to, but I'm going to press the Enter key and finish off my if with an end. Every if has to have an end. It doesn't have to have an else, and in this case, I'm not going to do that, but it does have to have an end. And once I finish working on my calculated field, I want to look down here at the bottom. And if the message is the calculation is valid, I have no errors up here. Now, if I did have an error message down below, the calculation contains errors, I can click a little drop-down arrow and it says expected end to match if. Oh, I forgot my end. We have to add that in, and then the calculation is valid. So I'm going to click OK, and now my sales rep calculated field is over here in my dimensions portions of my data pane with a little ABC in front of it, indicating that that calculated field is a string value because it has the first and last name with a space. It also has a little equal sign in front of it, meaning it's a calculated field, which means I can either right-click or drop-down arrow on that dimension, and I can edit, and I can make changes to the calculated field if I need to do it. Next in the exercise is to filter the worksheet to only include orders placed from the previous quarter. And I'm going to use my order date dimension to do my filter. So if I look in my orders sheet, there is an order date dimension right there. And I know it's a date field because I have a little calendar icon to the left of it, which means it contains date data. Now, I have something on my chart called the filters shelf. It's up here to the right of the data pane, and if I want to filter or narrow down the sheet, I drag a dimension or measure to the filter shelf. I'm going to drag my order date and drop it on the filter shelf. And I now get a filter dialog box giving me different date levels that I can filter on. Well, one of the options I have here at the top of my filter dialog is what's called a relative date. Relative date is a filter relative to the current date, today. And I want to see orders from the previous quarter as of whatever day it is. So I'm going to choose relative date and click Next. Now I have options here in my relative date for years, quarters, and so forth. If I'm looking for the previous quarter, I'm going to choose Quarter, Previous Quarter, and click OK. I now see the order date field on the filter shelf, meaning it's filtering this worksheet. If I want to change the filter, I can right-click or drop-down arrow on order date on the filter shelf, edit filter, and make a change. The exercise now asks me to analyze order amount by discrete day of week, and discrete day of week would be individual days of the week regardless of the month or regardless of the quarter, simply Sunday through Saturday, all underlying date periods, months, years, quarters rolled up as a vertical bar chart. So there's a whole bunch of ways of doing this. I'm going to start by double-clicking the measure I want to analyze. I'm going to double-click the order amount measure, and that adds it to Tableau as a vertical bar chart by putting the order amount on what's called the rows shelf. We see it up here. Now I can undo that with the little left arrow in my toolbar, and I could just as easily drag order amount and drop it on the rows shelf and get the exact same vertical bar. Now I want to analyze by discrete day of week. That's not super clear, but it's actually going to be based on the order date. So I'm going to grab my order date dimension from my orders sheet and drag it onto the columns shelf. And I end up getting just one little dot here because when I drag a date field up here, look, Tableau automatically rolls up to the year date level. There are a whole bunch of ways of changing this from year of order date to week of order date. I'm going to come up to my column shelf and either right-click or drop-down arrow on that order date, and rather than year, I'm going to choose more and pick weekday as my date level. And I now get weekday of order date up here, and I now see a line chart, all 3 months of the last quarter rolled up simply by day of week. Now, I ask in the exercise to have this be a vertical bar chart. By default, Tableau makes it a line chart because Tableau assumes if I'm analyzing data by some kind of a date dimension, my visual best practice is to look at it as a trend over days. Well, I don't want to see a line chart. I want to see a bar chart. This particular line is what we often refer to as a mark type. You're going to hear me talk about marks throughout this course. Mark being a part of a line, being a bar, being a circle. We make changes and adjustments to marks in a section of Tableau between the data pane and the chart canvas we refer to as the marks card, and I see it here in the middle. The first thing in my marks card is a drop-down of available mark types. But if I click the drop-down, I have a choice of mark types, and I want to change the chart to use a bar mark type rather than an automatic mark type. And when I make that change, I now see a bar for Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Apparently I had no Tuesday sales in the quarter. So what I want to do now is, in addition to seeing my bars for days of the week, I want to break the data down within each day of the week by that sales rep calculated field I just created. Create stacks for each sales rep. If I am going to be creating different color segments of the bar, so I want one color for one sales rep and another color for another sales rep, I'm going to make some change to the color part of the marks card. Now I can click the color button on the marks card and change the color. That's going to change all the blue bars to orange or all the blue bars to red. But what I want to do instead is have colors assigned based on another field. In this case, on that sales rep calculated field we just created. So I'm going to go down to my dimensions box and scroll down because my calculated fields end up at the bottom of my dimensions box, and there's that sales rep calculated field that I'm going to drag and drop onto color on the marks card. What I notice now is a stacked bar chart with different colors for each sales rep. And if I look over here on the right side of my chart, I see a color legend that indicates who the blue sales rep is, who the orange sales rep is, and so forth. I'm going to make one quick little adjustment. See all this white space over here on the right side of my chart? I want to fill this entire chart canvas up with the chart, have those bars be nice and wide, and I want to do that automatically. So I'm going to come up to my toolbar up here. This is the fit choice. I'm going to pick entire view to fill the entire chart canvas with the chart. Nice big wide bars. Now I have marks on here. Remember we talked about marks in the marks card. Each segment of each bar is an individual mark. And when you saw the little demo of Explain Data, we could click a mark, get the tooltip, click the light bulb, and get an Explain Data dialog box. In this case, Carly Bolter for Monday is within the expected range based on all of the values. There's no data to explain here. How about this small chunk of Thursday? Now we're actually getting a little chart down here that breaks that down and shows me another chart and explains why we have that particular value there. So I've done several explanations of data. Here's what's new in 2020. Resize the dialog to make it smaller or make it larger, and little I button down here to give me more deep explanation for what that particular explained data is. Let's do a little bit more to finish off. I've created a new workbook in Tableau, workbook being a series of sheets, worksheets down here. This is very much like Excel. Right now, this is sheet number 1. I'm going to double click that sheet number 1 tab, and we're going to name this sheet Explain Data. I now see the name of that sheet at the top. This is my first chart. And I can pull down my File menu now and Save As. And let's save our hands-on exercise in what's called a TWB format. That's the default format for a Tableau workbook. And save. I already have it on the disk. Do I want to replace it? Yes. And there is my first worksheet and my first experience with Explain Data. So now you have an idea of some of the new features of Explain Data. Not a huge new feature, but something that you may make use of. I'm still curious if you're using Explain Data, if you find it helpful and find it valuable. Comment down below on Explain Data. How are you using it? Are you using it? And do you like it? Next, let's move on to dynamic parameters. This feature has been requested for years and years, and it's finally here. So here's a visualization using a standard measure sales and then a second measure called projected sales. And at this point, projected sales, if I edit that calculation, is simply increasing sales by 10%, regardless of anything else. What I want to do is actually prompt a viewer for a region because we're going to project different sales increases or sales changes depending on which region we're analyzing. So the immediate thought is, let's just pick region in our dimensions list, right-click, and choose Show Filter. And here's my interactive list of regions over here, Central, East, North, or All. And I can just click my region here. The problem is that's filtering the worksheet to just the regions I select. I do not want to filter based on regions, so that's going to come off my filter shelf. Instead, I want to prompt for a region without filtering and use the value from the prompt in the calculated field. So if I'm prompting for something but not filtering, I'm going to use something called a parameter field. Up to my dimensions box I go, drop down arrow, and there's an option on the menu to create parameter. Dialog box appears. I'm going to give it a meaningful name, call it region to analyze. I'm going to make this a string parameter because it's going to contain words, central, south, and so forth. Now, allowable values. I want to restrict the list of values to actual regions in my data source. So I'm going to choose a list. I want it to populate from the data source. Yes, we could do that in 2019 and earlier, but that was the only option there was. And I can pick a value from a field or a dimension like region. And here are my 4 regions in my data source so far, Central, East, South, and West. The problem was if we went back to our data source and added some new data or changed some data so some new regions appeared in the data source, this parameter list would not reflect that change. We'd have to open the workbook, edit the parameter, reread the database, and save the workbook again. That would be the only way to get the new set of regions, and if something changed later, we'd have to do it all over again. In 2020.1, we now have an option to update this list when the workbook opens. I'm going to make that choice, pick that same region dimension from the data source, and I have the same 4 regions. We're going to make a change in a minute, though. I'm going to click OK. That parameter now appears in its own part of the data pane down here on the lower left. I'm going to go ahead and drop down arrow and show parameter control, and it now appears over here on the right side of the chart as a drop-down list of choices: central, east, south, and west. There they are. Now, I'm going to edit the calculated field and make use of the parameter field. I'm going to add a test, particularly against the region to analyze. And if it is the south region, then my sales is going to increase by 10%. I'm going to add an additional test, the same region parameter field, testing for a value of north. We expect good growth in the north, so sales is projected to increase by 25%. Other regions are expected to be flat sales-wise. So now that I've done my calculated field, let's check the parameter value here. Central region, you notice these numbers are the same. My south region, I see my numbers go up 10%. My other regions should be flat. Central is flat, west is flat. What I want to do also is make sure my viewer understands the region I'm analyzing, so I want to add that parameter to my chart title. I'm going to edit the chart title, add a little hyphen after it, and then in this insert option on the right side of my chart title editor, I have an option to insert that region to analyze parameter and maybe follow it with the word region. And now when I click OK, my title indicates also the parameter value I've chosen: west region, central region, south region, and my sales also changes. So I'm using the parameter in 2 places, both in the calculated field and on the title. Here's the deal. I'm going to save the workbook, close it. What happens if my underlying data changes now and I have new data in the north region? Let's go to our data source, which happens to be an Excel sheet. This first order in here, we're going to recategorize as a north region order. I'm going to save that worksheet. Now my data source has changed. Remember that parameter field was set to re-look at the data source when the workbook opens and get me a current set of data. Let's open that workbook again. Let's go find our parameter over on the right. And remember, I changed nothing in the workbook, and here is my north now being read from the data source. I see my 25% growth projected, and I also see that north region in my title. But that north region was added automatically when the workbook was opened. That's the new dynamic parameter. So that's a look at dynamic parameters. Now, time to get your hands on exercise 2 in the workbook with dynamic parameters, and then you may come back and either I'll go through it with you or you can skip to the next lesson. Dynamic parameters hands-on. See you in a few minutes. If you want more in-depth training, either in person or online, you have a group to train, either on-site or online. You want Tableau dashboard design assistance, Tableau server assistance or implementation, I'd love to talk to you. Visit our website down below or a link up here, and we'll be happy to talk to you about how we can help you make the most of Tableau. All right, let's go through exercise number 2, dynamic parameters together. Now, if you're relatively new to Tableau, I am going to pick the speed up and the pace up a little bit. So you might actually want to use the YouTube feature to slow some things down, or you can use the pause option as often as you'd like. I'm going to create a new worksheet, which is the little plus sign over the bar chart here to the right of my existing explain data sheet. And I now have a new worksheet that I can use for my next chart. I am now going to filter to the last 3 months based on the order date. So I'm going to come to my orders table here. On order date, drag it to my filter shelf. A relative date is the choice I'm going to use. Relative date letting me pick based on today's date, a certain period of time back or forward. Next. and my relative date is going to be based on months and the last 3 months. I'm going to click OK. Now, I want to analyze order amount by what's called continuous week as a line chart. Order amount is a measure down here in my measures box. I'm just going to double click it, and it puts it on my row shelf as initially a single bar. Now, I want to analyze by what's called continuous week, in particular the week of the order, and that's going to be based on the order date again, the same thing I filtered on. I could do an entire involved lesson on all the features that Tableau has from a date perspective, but I'm going to cut to the chase, hold my right mouse button down, and drag order date onto the column shelf and drop it. If I'm using a Mac, I would use Option Drag. I now get a drop field dialog box. I have 2 series of date levels, a series here at the top, year, quarter, and month, and so forth, with some little blue pound signs. These are referred to as discrete date periods. And then I have another set of year, quarter, and date periods down here that have little green calendar clock icons. These are what we refer to as continuous date levels, and I want to use continuous week and click OK. And here is my chart now showing week, next week, and so forth continuously from the beginning of my previous 3 months up to the end of my previous 3 months. Now, what I am going to do is create a sales rep to compare to my overall trend. And I want to see what that sales rep sales is across the 3-month period as a reference line. So if they sold a total of $40,000 over the 3 months, I'd see that reference line right here at the $40,000 mark. If they did $60,000, the line would be up here. And I want to be able to pick the sales rep to show the reference line for, so I can compare individual sales rep sales to the overall trend. Now, I don't want sales reps to be filtered, so I'm not going to create a filter, an interactive filter. Instead, I'm going to create a parameter. So to my data pane I go, to the dimensions I go, little drop down arrow, and create parameter. We're going to call this parameter sales rep comparison. Sales reps are strings, first name, last name. So that's going to be a string data type. Now, I want to have a list of salespeople, and only salespeople, not other employees that are not salespeople. So if you recall, we created a calculated field a little bit earlier that used an if-then-else test to only return salespeople in a calculated field. And this is the key. If my sales rep data changes, someone gets married and their last name changes, or we hire additional salespeople, we want this list to reflect those changes automatically when the workbook opens. So we're going to use the When Workbook Opens choice, then choose our sales rep calculated field to populate the list, and there is our current list of sales reps as they exist at this moment in our data source. I'm going to click OK. Now, I want to see this parameter on the screen. So down here now in my data pane at the bottom is a new parameters category with my sales rep comparison in it. I'm going to right-click or drop-down arrow on that parameter and show parameter control. It now appears over here on the right with a drop-down list of my salespeople names. But nothing happens in here at this point when I change a different salesperson, because I now have to make use of the parameter somewhere on the chart. So I'm going to create a calculated field called Sales Rep Reference, and it's going to test the parameter field against the sales rep calculated field. And if they're equal, then I return the order amount. That's it. All right, the sales rep reference calculated field has been created, making use of the parameter field, and I want to use it to display a reference line on the chart. Remember from our discussion before the hands-on exercise that a measure has to be in use on the chart in order to use it in a reference line. So since my sales rep reference isn't anywhere on the chart, it won't be available in the reference line dialog box. So we're going to drag the sales rep reference to detail on the marks card. Now I'm going to click the Analytics tab. Now I can grab a custom reference line on the table for the order amount, not the week axis. Drop that reference line there. What do I choose for the value of the reference line? Not the order amount. I want it to be for my sales rep reference calculated field. And I don't want the average sale for the salesperson over the period of time. I want their total sales over the time. That's what I want to compare against. Now, a few other reference line requirements. I would like to have a light pink shade below the reference line. So down here toward the bottom of the dialog box, I'm going to click the drop down for Fill Below and pick a light pink. And I want to label the reference line with the actual value from the calculated field. So I'm going to come up to my label drop down and change it from computation to value, and it now shows the actual sales amount for my chosen salesperson. Click OK. Let's test the parameter field real quick and make sure it works. Currently, I'm comparing my sales to Catalina. Let's pick a different salesperson, and we see that actually that reference line is changing and moving depending on the salesperson. So the parameter field is now changing that calculated field. All right, I'm going to name this chart Sales Rep Comparison. And that shows up in the title of the chart by default. I want to add a second line of text to that chart that says compared to, followed by a space. And now which salesperson happens to be chosen in that parameter field. I'm going to click my Insert dropdown, and there's my parameters sales rep comparison value. Let's actually do a little formatting on this. Make it italics, color, change the font size, and now the title also reflects the parameter field. Perfect. Now I'm going to save the workbook, and I want to make sure I save it in what's called a TWB format, and we will discuss that here in a minute. So save as, make sure it's in TWB format. I'm calling it the Hands-On Exercise Workbook, and save it. I'm going to overwrite it. Here's what I want to have happen. I'm going to close this workbook. I want to go to my data source and make a change because I have actually had a salesperson whose name has changed. To the data source I go. In this case, it's the Retail Sales Excel workbook that you unzipped from the exercise files. In particular, we want to modify the employee sheet. Here's where our employees are. We see our sales representatives here. In particular, Gail Similton's last name has changed. She is no longer Gail Similton. Her last name is now Gail Roberts. So we're going to make that change to Gail's last name and save the Excel workbook. We've now saved that change, and we want to make sure that change is reflected in our Tableau workbook the next time we open it. So back to Tableau we go. Let's open the Hands-On Exercise workbook we just edited. We have the dynamic parameter field on it, and I'm going to drop down arrow and see who my salespeople are. And Gail Similton is now Gail Roberts. And when we use that, we see the parameter field is working fine. Here is our new reference line, and we are now comparing our overall sales to Gail Roberts. So that parameter field automatically changed to reflect Gail's last name change. All right, mini quiz time. Why a TWB file and not a TWBX file? Remember, when we save, we can choose a file format. I can choose a TWB or a TWBX file format. And the dialog box indicates TWB is a Tableau workbook and a TWBX is a Tableau packaged workbook. Here's the issue with TWBX files and dynamic parameters. A TWBX file saves the data source inside the workbook file so that it does not have to be accessed if that workbook is opened. So if I were to save a TWBX file, the Excel workbook this sheet is based on would be saved in the TWBX file, and the other file that I originally used would no longer be referenced by Tableau. And if I went and changed the salesperson's last name and opened the TWBX file, I wouldn't see the change because the TWBX file would no longer be referencing that original Excel workbook somewhere in its original location. So dynamic parameters depend on Tableau getting to the data source that was originally used when the parameter was created. TWBX files do not reference the original data source. So dynamic parameters require a TWB file format. There's dynamic parameters, a great way for you to get your parameter fields updated automatically every time you open a workbook. Now, let's move on to the buffer function. Tableau mapping has always been great, and the buffer function and radius analysis just makes it better. I'd like to create a calculated field to radiate out from the center of the United States, the geographic center of the contiguous 48 states, 100 miles, and I'd like to plot that radius on a map. The buffer function permits me to calculate a radius in miles or kilometers, I'm going to use miles, from a particular latitude and longitude, but the latitude and longitude have to actually be in a geographic format. So I'm going to create a calculated field. I'm going to call it radius from center of US. And I'm going to make use of the buffer function. That's the new function in Tableau 2020.1. It accepts 3 arguments, a geometry field and then a number and units. The geometry field might be new to you. It is not actually a latitude and longitude. It's a geometry data type that comes from geometric data sources like GIS systems. Well, in Tableau's calculated field language, we can create a geometry data type using what's called a makePoint function. So I'm going to supply as my geometry argument a makePoint function, and the makePoint function accepts latitude and longitude as arguments. I've actually copied to my clipboard the latitude and longitude for the geographic center of the U.S., got it off Wikipedia. Now I'm back out of my makePoint function. That's the first argument to the buffer function. The second argument to the buffer function is how many units, in this case miles, I want to radiate from that geographic location. I think I'm going to go 100 miles out. And the third argument to the buffer function are the units, miles, kilometers, and so forth. This is a string argument in quotes, miles, close quote, and I now have my buffer function ready to test. If I look in my data pane, it is a measure with a geographic data type. See the globe? Very much like latitude and longitude might be. If I double-click that geographic calculated field, it's placed on the marks card on detail using the collect aggregation, and here is my radius of 100 miles, and I see some map behind it. Let's zoom this map out, and I have a radius about 100 miles out from the geographic center of the U.S. There's the buffer function. All right, now it's time for you to get hands-on experience with the buffer function. I have a fun exercise for this one. That's going to be exercise number 3, hands-on. You can come back after you pause the video and either go through it step by step with me or go on to the next exercise. Buffer function hands-on, lesson 3. I'll see you in a few minutes. All right, let's create a new worksheet, plus sign over the bar chart. And I want to filter this sheet to just my sales representatives. So I'm going to find my position dimension and drop it on my filter shelf. and set it to be only sales representative positions that are included in the chart. I want to create a parameter that lets me vary the mileage that the radius is going to show. I may want to look 100 miles out from the sales rep's position. I may want to look 50 miles out, and I'm going to parameterize that to give my audience some more flexibility in analysis. We're going to go to our dimensions box, the drop-down arrow as we did in the last exercise, and create a parameter. We'll call the parameter territory radius. This is going to be a numeric parameter that doesn't need decimal places, so we'll make this a data type of integer. And I want to specify a range of values. Ultimately, I want to have a slider as my type of parameter. People love sliders. So the range for the allowable values will have a minimum of 50 miles, a maximum of 300 miles, in 25-mile steps. I'm going to click OK. Now I want to see that parameter on the canvas. I'm going to come down here to my parameters list at the bottom of my data pane, find my territory radius parameter I just created, right-click or drop-down arrow, and show that parameter control. Now I have the slider. I can slide starting at 50, 100, and so forth in 25-mile increments all the way to 300 miles. But nothing's happening when I slide the slider. I now have to make use of this parameter field in some other way on my chart. In particular, I'm going to use it in a calculated field to determine the radius from the center of my sales rep's territory. The calculated field is going to be called sales rep radius. I'm going to use the buffer function. And we remember the buffer function accepts 3 arguments. The geometry, which is a geometric data type, and I need to get that with a function called makePoint, because I happen to have latitude and longitude measures in my employee table. But in order to use them in the buffer function, I have to use makePoint to convert that latitude and longitude into a geographic data type. Territory lat is the first argument to makePoint. Territory lon is the second argument to makePoint. That's getting me the geographic data type that is the latitude and longitude of my sales rep's territory. Now back into the buffer function I go, and it's the number of units to radiate from the center of that location. Well, that number of units is coming from my territory radius parameter field. So I'm going to add a comma and then add the territory radius as the radius out from the center. And then in what? That's the third argument to buffer is units, and that will be in miles. Again, that is a string argument, so I surround it with quotes. I have a calculation is valid. Let's make that calculation editor a little bit bigger, and you can just take a look at it real quickly. Buffer, makePoint is the first argument with the territory lat and territory lon as the arguments. The second buffer argument is the territory radius parameter field, and the third buffer argument is the word miles in quotes. Now, if I look at my sales rep radius calculated field, I have a little globe icon next to it indicating it is a geographic data type that I double-click to visualize. When I double-click, it now creates a map and places that sales rep radius calculated field on detail on the marks card using the collect aggregation method. And now if I slide my slider, watch the radius change. I'm going to color and label marks by the sales rep name to make it easy to understand which sales rep is being visualized. So my sales rep name calculated field is going to be dragged to color on the marks card. And I'm also going to drag that sales rep calculated field to label on the marks card so that each of these radiuses is a different color and labeled by the sales rep name. Now, since each of the radiuses is labeled by the salesperson's name, the color legend is redundant. So I'm going to come to the color legend on the right side of the chart. There's a little drop-down arrow on that color legend that I'm going to click, and then from the context menu, I have an option to hide card, which will make that color legend go away. There is the buffer function. On to the mini quiz, the maximum mileage that can be given sales reps to avoid overlap in territories. And there's a little caveat within the limits of the parameter field. So we're going to try different radiuses here. I'm going to go to the max of 300 miles. And I get a whole lot of overlap, so we have many overlapping sales rep territories here. If I go to the minimum, nobody's overlapping, so the question is, what's the maximum mileage that can be given to avoid any overlap? And I'm going to simply keep clicking until I get one little bit of overlap in any two territories. It looks to me like 175 has a little tiny bit of overlap here between these two sales reps. So I'm going to go back to 150 and say the answer is 150 miles is the most we can radiate a territory without overlapping another territory. So there's the buffer function, a way for you to map radius out from a center point, helpful for more valuable mapping in Tableau 2020.1. Next, let's go on to animation. If you happen to have a pre-release version of Tableau or you saw the technology preview, you've seen this, but now it's finally released in Tableau 2020.1. Helps you kind of follow a dimension along a chart as things change, maybe filters change. So let's take a look at new animation features. Here's a bar chart colored by a subdimension to make the colored bars a little bit easier to follow around the chart as I interact with it. For example, I have a couple of filters here, one filter based on a quarter and one filter based on a region. And by default, Tableau 2020 and earlier versions simply refreshes the chart whenever you make a filter change. It's pretty much instantaneous. Well, 2020 introduces animations. There are two ways of animating. You may set default animation options for the entire workbook or make a worksheet by worksheet choice. This is done from the Format menu, Animations option, which replaces the Data pane with the Animations pane. First, at the top of the Animations pane is a Workbook default setting. By default, it's off. You can turn the Workbook default on and set a duration and style, and then all new worksheets will take on those settings. Or on a sheet-by-sheet basis, so for example, in this case, the selected sheet, you may make changes. Notice that it is off by default. Let's just turn animation on for this worksheet and leave the default duration and style in place. And now let's come and interact with these filters again. And we see a little bit of a change as bars increase or decrease in size or as they move around a little bit. So it's just a little bit easier on the eyes, but not necessarily any more useful from a visualization perspective. Let's play with some of the duration and style options and see what kind of changes we can make. I'm coming over to my animations panel, and I'm going to change the duration to a little bit slower. Let's go to a medium setting, and then let's change the style from simultaneous to sequential. So speed and style change, come back and interact with the filter. So it's animating a little bit slower, and we actually see it animating in two different parts. First of all, the marks resize in an animated fashion, and then after they've resized, they move. Let's slow it down a little bit more. Go to a 1 second duration, and now it's even easier to see changes as they occur. All right, now it's time to have a lot of fun with animation. I have a couple of really good hands-on exercises for you. Exercise 4 in the workbook, hands-on with animation. You can come back and either go through it step by step with me or skip right on to the next topic. Animation, hands-on. I'll see you in a few minutes. All right, let's create a new worksheet. And initially, when you create a new worksheet, it's going to use the existing data source you used in previous sheets as your default data source, but you are not limited to using just one data source in a workbook, and I want to add a new one in this workbook to use with this worksheet. So I'm going to come up to my toolbar and click the plus over the barrel button. That is a new data source button that displays the same Connect dialog box you see in the Tableau welcome screen, and I'm going to choose Microsoft Excel. And in that same folder that we unzipped our sample files in is another data set called Gapminder. This is from the Gapminder Foundation. You're going to watch one of the Gapminder Foundation's videos here in a minute. I'm going to open that Gapminder workbook, and I find two worksheets in here, Country Statistics and Geography. I'm going to add Country Statistics first, Geography second, and the automatic join is going to be fine. Now I'm going to go to sheet number 4. And now I have two data sources up here at the top of the data pane, and I can choose either the retail sales or the Gapminder data set to use, and in this case, I'm going to use the Gapminder data set for this new worksheet. There's one dimension here that's interesting. That's the year dimension in the country statistics table. Generally, Tableau will take numeric fields and place them down here as measures. But depending on the data set and depending on field names, Tableau may elect to make a numeric field a dimension. It's going to leave the pound sign on there, but put it in the dimensions box. Now, in this case, there's a little interesting ramification. If we look very closely at the icons, we see blue icons on all other dimensions. We see green icons down here on measures, and then the year dimension that's numeric has a green color icon on it. Now, there's a lot more discussion on the actual detailed difference between the colors. I'll simply say for brevity that green fields are treated as continuous values in Tableau, and blue fields are treated as discrete values. In this case, I really do want year to be treated as a discrete value for some filtering purposes. So I'm going to right-click or drop-down arrow on year and convert to discrete. And you'll now notice the icon to the left of the year field turns blue, and that comes in handy for some visualization that we're going to do. Now I want to analyze population by country as a horizontal bar chart, and the horizontal bar chart is important. So rather than just double-clicking population, which would put it on the rows shelf, I'm going to grab population and drag it to columns to get a single horizontal bar. And now I'm going to grab the country dimension and drag it onto rows to get one row per country, and I now have my horizontal bar chart. And there's lots of countries here, so it's a fairly tall chart. What I want to do is sort in high to low order. I'm going to come to my toolbar about halfway across, and there are two sort buttons. The down arrow with the bars getting larger and the down arrow with the bars getting smaller. The down arrow with the bars getting smaller is my descending sort button. I will click that and now sort my chart in high to low order by population by country. Two filters to add. First of all, that year dimension that we changed to discrete. We want that to be an interactive filter. In particular, I want it to be a slider. So I'm going to right-click or drop-down arrow on it and choose Show Filter, puts it on the filter shelf, and also adds it over here as a multi-select interactive filter. I'm going to go to the filter, little drop-down arrow at the top of the multi-select filter, and I'm going to change it to a single value slider from the context menu. Now I can pick one year at a time by sliding or clicking the arrows. I also want to add the 4 regions dimension as a multiple checkbox filter, including all. I'm just going to come to the 4 regions dimension in the data pane, right-click or drop-down arrow, show filter, and by default it appears as a multi-checkbox with an all checkbox as well, and that's what I'd like to do. Now I want to color the chart by a subdimension so that I can color bars with some other dimension that kind of breaks them down into subcategories, and that's the 8 regions dimension. I'm going to drag that onto color on the marks card, and now I can see different colored bars depending on a sub-region that each country belongs to. Now if I look at filters, years, slide the slider, click the arrow, change 4 regions to just Africa, or Africa and the Americas, or the Americas and Europe. I can see things change, but they change very rapidly, and I really have no way of kind of following dimensions or following countries as we make slight changes to filters, maybe from year to year. So I would like to turn on animation for this worksheet only and initially look at things from a default setting. Format menu. Animations. By default, turned off in this workbook. For this selected sheet, sheet 4, I haven't given it a name yet, I'm going to turn automation on and just leave the default settings and now interact with the filter year by year. Checkbox. And I see the bars moving smoothly, but it's not necessarily super easy to find a country moving from place to place to track kind of how they've moved as we've made some subtle change. So at this point, I have some options on my animation setting. The duration I might want to change to a 1 second slow setting, and maybe I'll change my style to sequential from simultaneous. And now let's take a look as we navigate year to year. We can see them moving from place to place. Makes it a little easier to see. And if I come up and change my 4 regions filter, easier to see things change. Moving a little bit slower, but it's much easier to see how countries are changing and moving from place to place. Now I'm just going to rename this sheet to Animations.
Now I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East...
All right, if you have not already done so, take a break, head over to YouTube and watch the Hans Rosling video that I make reference to in the exercise, and then come on back and we will do the bubble chart together. All right, let's create a new worksheet. We're going to use the same data source we did for the previous animation exercise for the Hans Rosling scatter plot. A scatter plot being a chart, looks kind of like what's called a bubble chart in some cases, but it's got numeric measures on both columns and rows. So we're going to grab the year field and make it an interactive slider, pretty much like we did before. I'm going to grab year and drag it to the filter shelf, pick 1810, click OK. Now drop down arrow on the filter shelf on year and show filter so that it can appear over here. It's a multi-checkbox filter. We want to change it to a single value slider. Income per person is going to go on the columns shelf. That is a measure on columns. Life expectancy on the rows shelf, that is a measure on rows. And if I put a measure on rows and columns, I get the beginning of what's called a scatter plot. It shows the axis for each measure on the X and Y portion of the chart, and then one combined aggregated mark here in the upper right. We want to change this from an open circle to a solid circle, make it a little bit easier to see. Marks card, the mark type drop down, we change to circle. I now want to get 4 different circles, one for each of the 4 regions dimension value. The 4 regions dimension then is dropped on color on the marks card, and I get 1 colored circle for Africa, Americas, Asia, and Europe. Remember in the Hans Rosling video, continents were colored. We are going to drag population onto size. The population measure goes on size on the marks card to size the circles based on the overall population of the 4 regions. I would like to have the circles larger overall. I'm going to click the size button on the marks card and slide the slider farther to the right to simply make the marks larger overall, while there still is a size disparity based on population. I now want a different circle for each country. I don't want a different color for the countries. I don't want a different size for the countries. I simply want there to be 1 circle for each country, colored by the region that that country is in, and then sized by population. That simply is involving dragging country to detail on the marks card. I now see that there are 6 nulls here that were introduced based on some little data disparity. We're going to right-click on that null indicator and simply hide it for now to get it out of the view. I also want this chart to use the entire width and height of the screen. I'm going to go to the top of my toolbar, pull down my Fit drop-down and choose Entire View. I'm going to slide between years. 1811, 1812, 1813. So I'm seeing marks moving from place to place, but again, it's a fast snap and it's not really easy to follow things around. So let's pull down our Format menu and choose Animations. Let's turn this particular worksheet animation setting on. Let's go ahead and pick a slow speed and a sequential style. And now let's go from year to year, and you can now see countries as they adjust and move. This was very much as things appeared when Hans was doing his video. Let's take it a step further. As Hans said, now let's start the world. We're going to animate this chart so we can literally play with a play button the chart from year to year. I'm going to close my animations pane and go back to my data pane. Right now I have the year field on the filter shelf, which means I am filtering a year at a time with this interactive filter. I am going to drag the year dimension off the filter shelf and onto what's called the Pages shelf. The Pages shelf is kind of like a filter shelf. It still filters, but the change is I can play the animation year by year without having to manually advance it, number one. Number two, the filter shelf also looks at the entire data set over all time and sets the axis to match the outliers in the data set. So in 1810 or 1811, I have a whole bunch of income per person scale here because when we get to 2017 and 2018, we have some countries that have a lot more money. We're going to adjust the scale a little bit later, but let's at least see how we can now play through time. I'm going to come over to the right side of the chart. I also have options for playing forward or backward in slow, medium, or fast speed. I'm going to pick a fast speed and play this chart. Now you see things moving. It's a little hard to see things happening because as the years go, things aren't changing a whole lot down here in the lower end of the scale because these income per person numbers are set for the high 2000s. So what I'm going to do to just make it a little more understandable why things look the way they do is advance to a much later year. Let's come to maybe 2000. See how these marks change, and now let's play from 2000 on. And we can see things moving a little bit smoother. Let's fix this axis range so we don't get all the white space over here on the right. If we looked at some very small countries here, we can start to see why we have such a wide range here, and there's probably even a country farther over here on the right a little bit later on in the time period. We're going to right-click on the income per person axis, edit axis from the context menu, and rather than allowing Tableau to create the automatic range, we're going to choose a fixed axis range starting at 0 and ending at 75,000. Now I simply close the axis dialog box and we can see a much smaller axis range, and I'm going to back up a few years, play, or as Hans says, start the world, and here is Hans' chart in Tableau. I've always wanted to bring that Hans Rosling chart to life in Tableau. There it is, animation making it just better. Nice new feature in 2020.1. Last but not least, a new feature with dashboards, an export button. Now your viewer, simply by clicking a button, can export the dashboard in a file format. Let's have a look. In tiled mode, I'm going to drag the export object onto the chart, and I think I'll drop it over here underneath a color legend. We could maybe put it on top of that color legend, but wherever I want it to go, I'm going to drop it in. It could be in floating mode or tiled mode. Now, by default, it just says export to PDF. I'm going to drop down arrow on that button, edit the button, and I have options. Export to what file format, image, PDF, and PowerPoint are options. I'll choose PowerPoint. Let's see what that does. What type of button? A text button or an image button. In this case, I'm going to leave it as a text button. If I did choose an image button, I could click the Choose button and actually go navigate on my drive for an image file to put in the button. We'll leave it as a text button. The text is going to be Export to PowerPoint. I can change the font if I'd like, change the font size, change the color, make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to leave border and background options alone, although I could customize them, and then I'm going to add a tooltip. Now, I don't have necessarily enough room for all the text over here, but the idea is now you have that button ready to click. In this case, because I don't want to select the button object, I actually want to execute it. On my Mac, I'm going to hold my Option key down. On Windows, you hold the Alt key down, and when you click, it executes the button and is now going to save my dashboard to PowerPoint on my computer. All right, now it's your turn. Hands-on with the Dashboard Export button, exercise number 5 in the workbook. Take a few minutes. I'll see you back here. All right, I'm going to create a new dashboard with the plus over the forest square button, give the dashboard a name, and choose an automatic dashboard size. The data pane is now replaced with the dashboard pane, and one of the options is size. Depending on your audience, depending on their screen resolution, depending on the devices they're using, you may want to pick a fixed size. In this case, I want it to automatically resize depending on the screen resolution that it's being viewed in. So I'm going to change that to an automatic size. I am now going to add 3 worksheets in tiled mode. Down here at the bottom of the dashboard pane is a tiled floating button. I want to make sure tiled is gray, that's selected, and worksheets will now snap onto the dashboard in a very precise fashion, and no worksheet will overlay another. We want them to be precise. The first worksheet is the buffer function. That's going to be the map. I'm going to drag that to the dashboard. I now want dynamic parameters, that sales rep line chart. That's going to go at the bottom of the dashboard, take up the entire bottom portion of the dashboard for now. And finally is going to be the animation, the horizontal bar chart. That's going to split the lower right of the dashboard by dragging and dropping it. I want to add a button to permit a viewer to export this entire dashboard in PDF format with one click. There is a new export object in the dashboard pane. I am going to drag it on the dashboard like I did those worksheets. I have to decide if I want it to float or if I want it to be tiled. I think I'm going to float the export button. So down we go to the bottom of the dashboard pane and choose the floating option. And now when I drag the export button onto the dashboard, it moves pretty much wherever I want to drop it. I think I'll drop it here in the lower left in the ocean, and we can have it there. By default, it appears as a text button. We want to change this. I'm going to click the drop-down arrow on that button and edit the button. We're going to make some changes. We're going to leave it set to a PDF export format. That's fine. But rather than a text button, I want to choose an image button. And now when I click the Choose button, it launches a dialog box looking for a file. I'm going to find my desktop where I created that folder. Within that folder is an export button ping file that you unzipped as part of the sample files, and we're going to have that be the image for our export button. I'm going to add a little tooltip text, export to PDF. I can resize this export button and move it down a little bit lower left to be over the ocean. If I hover my mouse over that, I should get an export to PDF. So there is my tooltip. Now, I'm going to click it, and all that does is select the button as much as I would select any other sheet on the dashboard. To actually execute the export, I'm going to hold Alt-click on my PC or Option-click on my Mac, which executes the button, launches a Print to PDF dialog box where I can pick the entire workbook or the active sheet, which is that dashboard, portrait or landscape mode, click OK, and it will launch a dialog box asking me for a PDF file name where it will export that dashboard to a PDF file. So there it is. New features of Tableau 2020.1. I hope you enjoyed the hands-on format. If you liked the video, thumbs up. For some reason you didn't like it, thumbs down. Comment, subscribe, and click the bell to see more. Come on back, more Tableau videos in the future. I'll see you here.